how pleased we were to see so much interest. Um, it's great to have that kind of diversity from different parts of the world, different kinds of experience, different levels of experience, different numbers of years of working with qualitative approaches. So I'll hopefully be drawing as much as I can today on your experience. So we've got quite a lot to cover, and I would like to cover a substantial amount of the general information about what working qualitatively means, but also to look at some fine-grained accounts of qualitative approaches to collecting data so that you can see some real-world examples of what data looks like. So it gives us quite a tight schedule if we're gonna squeeze all of that in. So I'll just share my slides with you, give you a quick idea of what we are going to be doing today. So, as I say, as Holly said, it's day one of a 2-day summer school. Vishnu at some point later today might want to just say a few words about what's happening tomorrow, but we'll kick off with day one today. And this is an approaches to qualitative research. I am an applied linguist, so we work predominantly in my field of language education, language and migration, sociolinguistics. We draw a lot from qualitative approaches, but many of my colleagues also use more quantitative ways of working. So that will hopefully come up in our conversations today, how these aren't just as discrete boundaries around qualitative and quantitative as sometimes using the words in that way suggest. We can move across different approaches for different purposes. So I'll be talking about why we're here. I'll be talking about different research paradigms to get us started. And I'll also be saying a little bit in this first session about the different approaches that fall under qualitative. What I do want to say is a little bit about how we might make this participatory as we can in an online domain. I'd like you to put questions and comments in the chat as we go along. It doesn't mean that we'll respond to them immediately, but it does mean that we have a record then of issues and questions as they arise, and we can come back to them in the middle of the session. I think would be a good point to sort of look at where we are, and I'll keep an eye on the time. And then at the end of this 1.5 hours, Vishnu and I will take a look at what's in the chat and see if we can respond to some of the questions that you may have. So I'm happy for you to pop things in the chat as we go along so that they don't get missed. And as I say, about halfway through, we've got a short activity which will allow you to think through some of the issues that are coming up today. So that's the chat function. Holly's mentioned recording. One last thing before we get started is I've aimed to talk for an hour and a half, then have a short break, then have the second session, which is an hour and a half, and then have 30 minutes for what would be in the UK a lunch break. But if you're overseas, that might be a different kind of break, for 30 minutes. And then we'll come back together for the third and final session, which is also 1.5 hours, about 90 minutes. I will record, I'll stop recording at the end of each hour and a half, otherwise that's going to be a huge file. So I'll stop recording. So if you could come back into the session after the break by clicking on the same link. At the moment, I've just got up on my screen my slides. So, but I can use my mobile phone for having a quick look at the chat. And Vishnu's also monitoring the chat. So that's very useful. So what we could kick off with is the 3 questions that I sent round a week or so ago. If you could just pop in the chat now, what aspects of qualitative research are you interested in? It could be just 1 or 2 words, it could be 3 or 4 words. Describe in 2 or 3 sentences the languages used in a context you know well. That might be your context. So if, for example, you're in the UK, it may just be English. If you're overseas outside the UK, it may be more than 1 language variety. And again, just 2 or 3 sentences, absolutely maximum. And then the third question is, what would you most like to see included in the workshop? So if you pop those in the chat now, and then we'll have a quick look. So we've just got an idea of who is in the room and how I might tailor some of the content to the specifics of what you're interested in. So I'm only going to give you 2 minutes to do that now. If you could put those items in the chat. Okay, that's great. That you can continue to do that, and we can come back to those later, and we can also draw on them at various stages throughout the day. But that is really useful. People are mentioning things like code switching, language use, different ages, prestige, status, research design, multilingualism, cultural meanings around different language use, and multilingualism. Not surprisingly, for the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism, I will be talking quite a lot today about different approaches to understanding what multilingualism is and its relationship to reading and writing, given that we are the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism. So I'm going to just go back to my slides. Ah, great. And this time I can see some of you and a little bit of the chat and my slides. So I'm going to keep it on this view. I hope you can see the slides okay. So as I said, I am, well, I'm an applied linguist. So I'm working in a field of linguistics that looks at how language is used in real world settings. So some of you here may be working in educational settings, you may be more focused on workplace settings or clinical settings. The applied linguist goes into a range of different settings and takes what we know about language use and language learning and applies that to the particular context in which they are working. So I'll be drawing specifically from examples from my particular research, as well as the research of others. My core methodology that I draw on is ethnography and linguistic ethnography. I'll be talking about those approaches throughout the day. But to kick us off, I wanted to start with some keywords. We're looking at different aspects of inquiry. We aim to be systematic. So I'll be talking very much, somebody mentioned in the chat, research design. I'll be talking about how do we move through the various stages of research design when we're working in a qualitative paradigm. And as part of that, I'll be saying quite a bit about how we understand criticality. What does this term critical mean in much of the work that I'm involved in, and others, again, working in qualitative approaches? What do they understand by critical and being self-critical? So an important place to start is clearly within the paradigm. What do we mean by a research paradigm? Well, hopefully what you can see here is that it is a philosophical view on how we understand the nature of research. What does it mean to go into a research setting? Whether that's online, whether that's out in the community, or whether that's working at your desk on secondary research, working with the literature, we still have an underpinning philosophy that grounds us in a particular paradigm. And those decisions that we make are framed by the specific paradigm that we work in. And the important thing to say here is that we recognize working qualitatively requires us to be very clear about the positionality of us as researchers. So I'll talk later about the term bias and reflexivity and positionality, and the difference between these terms, and how by reflecting on our position in the research setting and as researchers is a fundamental part of working qualitatively. Most of what I'll be talking about today probably sits within a post-positivist or constructivist paradigm. There are other ways of situating yourself in qualitative work, but I would say the lion's share of approaches that require the researcher to go into specific settings and work with research participants requires us to understand the relationship between language and society and language as culture as socially constitutive. By being in the research setting, we are having an impact on those relationships. And every time language is used in a way that makes a little bit transparent some of those social cultural relationships. So it's a constructivist a paradigm that I'm going to be really situating myself in for today. This also requires us to mention our ontological approach, our view about the nature of reality. Again, today I'll be orienting to a more kind of critical realist and relativist type of ontological perspective, that there is a reality out there, or there are realities out there, but it somewhat depends on our perspective and our understanding of how research fits into these different agendas that allow us to find out the things that we want to find out. So I'll be drawing on these different approaches, ontological approaches, and what it means to take a particular epistemological stance. So if epistemology is our view on the nature of knowledge, then again, that frames everything about the way that we tackle our research questions. How do we formulate research questions, our assumptions about research design and what it means to use interviews or participant observation or a survey requires us to reflect on what we understand by the nature of knowledge and how is knowledge constructed? What is knowledge and how do we get to it? And again, some of you mentioned in the chat that you're quite interested in this relationship between language and culture, and the different prestige and the different status of different languages. So that requires us to say a little bit about this notion of being subjective. How do we bring our interpretation of the data? How do we bring it to bear on our analysis and our decision making? And what does that mean for working in a qualitative methodology? So I will come back to some of these big issues when we start to drill down into the detail of some of the data. So I'm using the term qualitative either as a sort of collocation with qualitative approaches or qualitative methodologies. Methodology being the overarching orientation of theories and methods, but not just methods on their own, but the theory generation and the approach that we take to the research holistically. So we can talk about more controlled or naturalistic methodologies. So do we want to work more towards a more experimental design, which can be more closely aligned with quantitative work, but it can also be drawn on in qualitative? Or do we tend towards these notions of more naturalistic type of design and more open-ended, more ethnographic orientations? Are we building a theory through our analysis? Are we trying to move towards generating a theory of how the world works? Or are we taking an existing theory and are we trying to test out that theory through the data that we've collected and analyzed? Thirdly, are we aiming to be very specific? I would argue that in the ethnographic work that we're going to look at later today, we are talking about very specific settings. They, the findings from our very specific setting might tell us something really interesting about other settings, but our goal isn't necessarily to generalize because we've got a very fine-grained account of what it means to work with those participants at that moment in time. So we're not always trying to generalize. I'll talk a little bit about qualitative and quantitative and how we can work with numbers in qualitative. We could work in with frequencies in qualitative approaches. It's not only within the remit of a more quantitative research design. And then finally, in terms of methodologies, it's really important to set out how do we see our relationship with the people that we are working with. In the past, you may have come across the term subjects. We avoid in a qualitative paradigm in the work I do, we very much avoid that kind of terminology. We're not doing research on people. We're hopefully doing research with people or perhaps about people, but they are participants, they are active agents in the research process. So this is something that's very, very contemporary in current debates around, well, how do we do that? We want to avoid tokenism. We want to avoid calling somebody a co-researcher if they don't have agency in the work. So when does it really become co-constructed? When does it really become participatory? And how do we avoid using these terms without fully embedding a co-constructed approach in our day-to-day working research projects? So as I say, we can ask how many and how much in a qualitative approach, but we tend to be asking questions along the lines of what, how, and why. We're really interested in the construction of meaning. How is meaning embedded in people's, multilingual literacies? If we take some of the work that I'll be talking about later today, that's interesting to people in CeLM, when people read and write, what are their purposes around reading and writing? How do they bring their real world experiences to reading and writing? Why do they do this? And what is happening in these particular settings? So we're aiming for quite thick descriptions. Not all qualitative is aiming for very deep, thick descriptions of social life, but thinking it more towards the ethnographic end, that would be our goal. How do we use the tools of interviews, observation, interactional data, and texts to construct thick descriptions of the domain that we've entered? So we might be working with quite small sample sizes to try to understand meaning across time and space. We are most likely trying to build theory because, again, it's very context specific. And we very much recognize that our presence in the research requires us to reflect on that. Moving away from the theoretical epistemological, ontological kind of underpinnings of a qualitative approach and towards the more observable and the more design related aspects of qualitative research, we can say quite definitively that we'll be talking today and maybe tomorrow in the sessions that Vishnu's put together um, about interview research, participant observation, analysis of texts, and ethnography, including participant observation. So you should get a really nice overview of what it means to choose these particular methods, how to carry out the different ways of working with these methods, how we might combine certain methods with other methods in order to fulfill the requirements of our study, and how they, again, how do we bring them back to some of the decision making that I've just been talking about. I won't talk about quantitative, but I will say that a mixed methods approach is also of interest to qualitative researchers. You know, we are very much working towards triangulation of data when we mix methods. So what can combining looking at frequencies, for example, what can that tell us about sort of interview data? So we're interested in the complementarity of that. How do certain methods fit together? How do we make them fit together? So how do they support each other? If we're using participant observation, what kinds of interviews fit around that? And of most interest, if any of you are PhD students or early career researchers, how do we pin down the decision making that goes into the kinds of importance or significance that we give to different data sets? And so I'll talk quite a bit about that later on today. So what I'd like to do now is get into ethnography. Hopefully the preceding slides have given you some sense of where qualitative ways of working come from and how we sort of understand those ways of working generally. What I want to do now for the rest of this session is get into ethnographic approaches. So if qualitative research is about understanding the qualities, the characteristics of something, and explaining social life through its characteristics, then a key qualitative methodology has to be ethnographic approaches, ethno relating to people and their cultural practices, and graph referring to something that is written about. So we're writing, we're inscribing, we're finding ways of using text and talk to try to say something meaningful about what people do in their particular community or family settings. This requires a holistic approach to research design. We need to consider different research tools, such as those that I mentioned in the previous slide. We need to work across interviews and observation and collecting real world artifacts of language use in order to understand how they fit together and how they give us a thick description of those individuals or those families' lives. We focus very much on the real world, which is challenging. Dealing with the mundane, the everyday, is one of the most challenging aspects of ethnographic work. We are programmed as human beings to jump to grand claims and big assumptions about how the world works. We have to be able to do that because we have to get through the day and have conversations with each other and draw on assumptions about why the way that the world is the way that the world is. We need to unlearn some of that if we're working ethnographically, because we really want to sort of try to go into the research setting and be interested in the mundane, be interested in what counters our assumptions and what bumps up against and shows a tension between what we think might be going on and what is actually situated at the moment in time that we're there collecting our data or generating our data. So this requires us to be open to social life as it happens. It requires us to use multiple methods, and it requires us to spend time with people. And that makes it a fairly challenging approach, given how busy we all are and how much we may have constraints around time and travel, perhaps. But in order to get to the emic perspective, the insider perspective, and how that insider perspective sits alongside the etic perspective, the outsider perspective, which may be us, the researcher, to some degree, it will be us, the researcher. We're always a researcher, even if we're doing an autoethnography of our own community or our own family, we also bring our researcher identities to that. So, what is the relationship between the researcher and the research participants, and how are we going to get to understand some of that emic perspective? I mentioned mundane, everyday events, and um, previous scholars have talked about the invisibility of everyday life, the things that we miss. And because everyday life can often be so mundane, so fine-grained that we don't necessarily notice it until we've pored over our interview data and we've pored over our research field notes, we're going to keep missing things until we get down into that data. We need to bring interpretation to it, and this can be challenging for people who are new to ethnography. It can certainly elicit claims of bias from people outside that tradition who think, well, what are you interpreting and how do you measure your interpretation? So later on today, I'll be talking about reflexivity. How do we understand this notion of bias? We're all biased, regardless of what paradigm we're working in. So how do we reflect on that in the different approaches that I'm going to talk about? Um, Thirdly, how do we tackle micro events? Again, those very mundane moment to moment events in people's lives that index a much broader set of behaviors or social practices. What's the relationship between what we see in our community-based organization, if we're working with an agency, for example, or we're going into a school, how does what goes on in that classroom on that day between those two learners that we are working with, how does that index wider socio-political practices? And how do we make sure we approach that indexicality in a critical way? That brings me to some of our key scholars. So I thought what would be quite useful would be, now that I've introduced lots of terminology, to really try to illustrate some of where this thinking has come from. So when you do the reading, when you go to the literature, when you look at the emergence of ethnography, we very much see the work of Del Hymes from the US, working in the 1960s, really putting language in its social context. Often language had been dealt with as if it was an abstract set of human characteristics or practices that can be decontextualized. And there are many research approaches that would deal with it in that way. But Del Hymes' work said that's fine for those particular ways of asking research questions. But if we fundamentally want to know about language back in its context, what research design do we need to come up with to understand language use in specific communities? And tomorrow, Vishnu and his colleagues will be talking in great deal about contemporary notions around decolonizing, around critique, and how we work with and across global South, global North relationships. And I think a lot of the current understandings of how we understand context comes back to the work of Delheims and others from other disciplines, but primarily within linguistic ethnography, we can trace it back to his work. Going much further back in time, there's lots of literature we can draw on. I would encourage participants to look at Bakhtín's work, who again, many decades ago, was looking at notions of heteroglossia, the voices, the styles, the worldviews that exist within and across what we call languages. So this decoupling of the names that we give to languages, such as Hindi, English, Urdu, we've categorized them in those terms so that we can say something about how they're used. But right back to Bakhtin, we have been aware that those categories belie lots of fluidity. So I'll be talking more about this later on. We can also look at Bourdieu's work. Some of you might be working in education. You may be familiar with Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, useful in terms of these notions around the linguistic marketplace, ideas around linguistic capital. What does it mean to use Hindi and English at the sentence level in a classroom? What is the capital there? What does that give learners access to? What does that give employees access to? What does it mean to use standard British English in an academic assignment in the UK or in Pakistan, where Pakistani varieties of English are being used in classroom settings? So what is the capital in those different fields? I'm really interested in critical discourse analysis, and I'll be talking a lot about this in the third session today. And for those of you interested in the relationship between language and power, so Norman Fairclough wrote and continues to write extensively on this relationship. And again, a methodology that draws on social theory to analyze this relationship between language and inequality. And Jan Blommert's more recent work has, I think, to some degree, drawn on critical discourse analysis and obviously sociolinguistics to again look at how language is embedded in particular power structures. Talking of Blommert, here he is. So he has written extensively about multilingualism, that language practices are equally valid and accepted, or the assumption, sorry, that they're equally valid and accepted, and the notion of commenting on a particular language use tends to say much more about how that speaker is being placed in a social hierarchy than it necessarily does about the accuracy or proficiency of the variety that they're using. So we keep putting people in language hierarchies, and we keep putting languages in language hierarchies that, to draw on the language ideologies literature from people like Woolard, say a lot more about what language symbolizes as opposed to the syntactic, grammatical, phonological aspects of those utterances. So a useful term that I'll come back to today is the idea of the language repertoire. Blommet challenges the idea of fixed languages. So I speak three languages is something that many people across the world would say. And that's based on, to varying degrees, of how we've come to understand what language use is. Actually, when people deploy the resources from those three different varieties, that they're not quite so clearly distinct as we would begin to first imagine. So a repertoire, a collection of flexible communicative resources, is a more helpful way, if you follow Blomet's work and many sociolinguists' work, is a more useful way of showing how individuals and speakers and writers move across their repertoire to fulfill different communicative functions at different moments in time. So we're going to look at that in a moment. So do try and hold on to some of this notion of a repertoire, because in about 5 minutes we'll be moving to the activity, and I'll be asking you to say a little bit in the chat function about your specific repertoire. So just to reiterate that point, that whilst in layman's terms, in lay terms, we would quite comfortably say, I speak Spanish, Portuguese, and English. If you were then to work to sit with that speaker and spend a day or a week with that speaker, we would see a more seamless, flexible use of different styles, registers, genres, varieties as they deploy the resources from that pool. So that's a little bit of a background on repertoire, which we'll keep. We'll need to come back to rationalize some of the research design that I'm going to be talking about when we look at different qualitative ways of working. And just before we get to that activity, I'd like to mention the scholar working, whose work I use quite a lot, Mohanty, who's working in India, looking at multilingual education, looking at mother tongue education. And again, very much drawing on what we know about inequality, globalization, the movement of people and how they, when they move around, as we have done for millennia, we take with us our linguistic resources. What does that mean then for how people learn together? So if we take the idea of a mother tongue, a language that is familiar to us from birth, that we use with our caregivers early on, and that might be a bilingual setting from very early on. And in much of Mohanty's work, it is that kind of bilingualism that he's talking about. What does it mean then to go into a classroom where a different language variety is being used to deliver the curriculum? So, textbooks might be in Hindi or in English, in his work. So we'll come back to that and what it means to take a critical approach to those language ideologies that I mentioned earlier. I'll mention my own work because I'll be drawing on examples from my work as well as other people's. As you probably have worked out by now, I have a particular interest in multilingualism, and migration and inequality and some of those language hierarchies. I'm very fortunate over the years to have worked in many different settings around the world, in South Asia, in the countries neighboring Syria, as well as currently I'm working on a big project in France, Spain, UK, and France, but always looking at the transnational relationships between the people in our research projects in France, Sweden, UK, and Spain, and their transnational connections with other parts of the world. So we're working with French families who have a cultural heritage from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. We're working with Swedish families who are working with refugees from the Middle East. How do we account for that using qualitative approaches? Bringing it right back to some of the interests within the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism, as Holly said earlier this morning, we are working primarily with people with an interest in multilingualism as well as reading and writing. Now, I do a lot of work with people around the text and the talk around the text. So it's not just reading and writing in a decontextualized setting, but rather how do people make sense of their reading and writing? What talk, what spoken language do they bring to their literacy practices. And I'll say more about literacy practices in the next session. But what's really important for now is to establish, how does this relate to qualitative approaches? Well, the first thing to say here is that a multilingual literacies approach describes the communicative repertoires of those groups and individuals who have more than one spoken or written language variety associated with their cultural inheritance. So, taking up this notion of repertoire, trying to foreground the fact that people move across different multilingual resources. They may not be proficient in all of those different varieties, and they're very much related to their cultural inheritance. Secondly, and most importantly, and most challenging for a lot of people, is the idea that there are multiple paths to acquisition. I work with lots of interesting researchers who would refute this. Well, they would refute it in their research. They would look in a more narrow, perhaps experimental way, to suggest that language is acquired in a more linear fashion, and that we learn languages developmentally. I don't want to stray into other people's territory here, but what I'm trying to say is that in this particular orientation, we're saying there's a whole host of language learning that goes on outside of formal settings, and what we're interested in by looking at multilingual literacies is, how do those boundaries around different domains, how do they position people in terms of developing additional literacy, or continuing to develop a language that is familiar to them if they're a migrant? So working qualitatively, what research design do we need to help to understand that people's literacies and reading and writing are quite fluid. And thirdly, orienting to Martin Jones and Jones's book, which is called Multilingual Literacies, this idea of the multiplicity of communicative purposes associated with spoken and written languages, and the traces of the social structures and language ideologies of the country. So we need to be very clear about the communicative purpose. If it's in a classroom, how do we pin down the learning and teaching that we're interested in? Or if it's in a family setting and we're interested in family language policy, how are those communicative purposes also recognized away from formal settings? And finally, to mention the role of language ideologies, which I've mentioned several times now, because we need to keep coming back to that. How does what people tell us about their communicative purpose, how is it shaped about how they perceive the value and prestige of that variety? I've been to many different settings around the world, and people tend to make quite strong value judgments about the role of different literacies, different varieties, different styles in their lives, because of the prestige that those styles, and it could be style, it could be script, it could be all of the different levels of language, bring with them ideologies around what is or isn't appropriate for that setting. So that kind of prescriptivism is very much shaped by language ideologies. So just before we get to the activity, I'd like to remind you that as linguistic ethnographers and sociolinguists, we're often interested in multilingual spaces and not orienting to bounded separate languages, but looking at the repertoire. And that brings us up against notions of translanguaging and code switching to understand how we carry out our work. And this is often linked to mobility. So what I would like you to do now, we've got 10 minutes before we take our break. Could I ask that for 5 minutes, you could put in the chat one example of how you have drawn on your linguistic repertoire for one activity, one task, one thing that you've done in the past 24 hours. It could have been your social media post. It could have been emailing a student about their essay. It could have been chatting to your family. So I'd like you to think about that moment or those moments and that activity. And I would just like you to say, if you're comfortable with terms such as language, variety, style, or genre, you could use those words. If you're not from a more applied linguistics background or education background, and you just want to say simply, I used this language for, then please go ahead and do that. But try to capture something of the shifting use of different communicative resources in the particular task that you fulfilled. And if you could pop that in the chat now, and then we'll just take a look at those. Thank you. Vishnu, could you also help keep an eye on what's going in the chat, please?
Yes, I'm monitoring it actually. So.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I think, Tony, you have some interesting comments in the chat. You may want to
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And Hamda's just asked, does ethnography as a methodology necessitate living in the field for months? I'll come back to that, Hamda. We've got very, very, very useful examples. Thank you for doing that because it means that I can draw on some.
I think you muted yourself, Tony.
Sorry. What I was just saying was thank you for putting the examples in the chat. I can use these when we come back to how do we make decisions about which qualitative approaches to use and to draw from. I can use some of these examples to illustrate the points that I'm making in the following sessions. So those are really useful. What I will say now, and keep putting them in the chat, um, because we can look at them on the break and we can come back to them later. But what I will do is I'll keep moving, and what I want to say is what does this mean for qualitative research or a qualitative approach to carrying out research? Well, I think the main thing to say is that when you look at, I won't name people because this is going to be recorded and I'm not sure people want to be named, but one of you posted about how you use different varieties in the shopping mall with different individuals. So what I'll be talking about later is how do we put together a project, different methods that enable us to work ethically in a shopping mall or in a school or in a community setting that allows us to either work with those individuals as co-constructors of knowledge, as participants, how do we work ethnographically in those settings, and how do we pin down the different varieties that you are all mentioning? One of you mentioned having a narrow repertoire. What I would say to that, and of course, that's something that my students who in the UK tend to be from more monolingual backgrounds, they will tell me that all the time. What we then do is we look at the relationship between style, register, genre. And so even though we might be working within a standard British English variety, as soon as you go online, you're mixing different stylistic resources, different registers. Your social media post will be quite different to your report that you submit to your boss in a very bureaucratic genre. So whilst we might not be moving across different varieties, we're constantly moving across different resources. So the repertoire isn't just for what we might define as multilingual speakers, but a repertoire approach enables us to look at all of those micro movements. Um, and just having a look at Vishnu's example comment, that multimodality, as soon as we move across different modes, we tend to be then deploying, you know, audio, visual, text-based modes alongside stylistic register, etc., etc. I don't want to stray too far from qualitative research though, because we needed to get into your multilingual settings because we want to understand where you are living and working. But we want to bring it back to the research design. So what I'll end by saying is, in the next session, I will talk more about data collection. So I'll break qualitative research methodologies down into the research tools that we use. So what are interviews and how do we carry them out and how do we analyze the data? What is observation? How do we do it? How do we analyze the data? So that hopefully gives you a sense of what we're going to be doing after the break. And then after the lunch break in the third and final session today, I'll be looking far more detail at actually doing some of that analysis. So I'll try to pull together what I've been saying this morning about critical multilingualism and language and power in a qualitative paradigm, What I've been saying about interview data and analyzing that using discourse analysis and actually do a little bit of data analysis together. So, with 1 minute to go, what I would ask you to do is continue to post any questions or any comments into the chat function. I will just for now be putting myself on mute and turning my video off while we have a 15-minute break. You
Yes.
can do the same, yeah, you can do the same, or you can click on the same link and that should bring you back into this space. I won't do that. At the end of the second session, I will stop the recording for the 30-minute lunch break, and we'll need to all click on the link so that we've got two separate recordings. But for now, you can either come back in 15 minutes or you can just put yourself on mute and turn your videos off. So thanks again for coming
Sorry,
along.
Tony.
And
There's
yeah,
a question. So do you want to take it now or when you come back?
I could take it now. How to analyze lost linguistic repertoires across ages, generations, and cultural entanglements. My quick answer to that fabulous question is if we're looking at people's repertoires that are no longer really being used, if we're looking at endangered languages or language varieties that are no longer, in common practice, then that's more of a historical linguistics because of an ethnographic approach, he's really trying to look at what people do in the moment. So if it's lost, then we would be using a different kind of methodology. The bit about cultural entanglements, I'll be saying a lot about in the next two sessions. Language and culture are always embedded in one and the other. So most of what I will be talking about after the break will relate to linguistic and cultural entanglements. Okay, on that note, see you in about 15 minutes time. Thanks, everybody. Hi, welcome back, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Great. Okay. I hope that gave you enough time to do what you needed to do. I'm going to keep my screen on this view simply because I can see you and I can see the chat and I can also see my slides, which is quite nice. So as long as you can also see the slides, you might have to see what's coming up on the left as well. So thank you for the continued comments in the chat. That's really useful. As I say, I'll try and draw on some of the examples that you're providing. I really like that Instagram post that colleagues shared. Um, Thank you, because I'll be talking about interactional data in this session. And when we look at that very fine-grained attention to specific utterances. And in that Instagram post, one of the speakers commented on, he said, like the R in French, and then went on to talk about the grammar. I that again is, perfect as a linguistic ethnographer to look at the relationship between the phonological aspects of the R in French and how that fits into his more kind of grammatical analysis of the pre-verbal. So anyway, that's a really nice example, and I'll try and come back to that later on. So as an example of qualitative approaches, I'll be spending this whole session talking about ethnography and specifically linguistic ethnography. So as I mentioned earlier, qualitative research requires us to look at the qualities, the characteristics, the meanings that people bring to their social lives. And a key qualitative methodology here is ethnography. Very important to start by foregrounding an ethical approach in this kind of work. How we understand the politics and ethics of working multilingually is constantly shifting. It's so fraught with challenges around power, the power dynamics of researcher and researched, the different hierarchies that people talked about in the chat function, um, the ways that we categorize and label different practices. It makes this very ethically challenging work. So it's important to foreground that we insist on an equitable and social justice approach. How we understand that will depend on our view of research, our ontological and epistemological choices that I talked about before. But there is a great deal of literature now that allows us to be able to understand much better than a few years ago about authenticity, respect, what it means to gain informed consent, this idea of empowerment. How is our research empowering? Who's it empowering? How do we reflect on how, as researchers, we are often doing quite nicely out of this research? I'm an associate professor at a university in the UK. Doing this kind of research brings me all sorts of benefits. What kind of benefits does it bring to the people that I work with? So how not to be tokenistic in talking about these issues. And all of that relates to then confidentiality. How do we make sure that the work we're engaging in provides opportunities for working confidentially? And accuracy is important here because we need to keep coming back to these decisions around ethical choices throughout the research journey, not just at the beginning when we're applying for ethical consent. And finally the other aspect of this, which I'll be talking about a lot today, is representation. Voice, again, has been written about for decades, if not centuries. How do we take some of that thinking and scholarship and apply it to what we're doing in the current era? I haven't really mentioned readings so far. I've given citations in my slides. I can share a list of readings through the sign-up sheet after this event. Um, coming out very soon is a chapter that I wrote last year for Suresh Kanagaraja's new handbook on migration and language, all about the ethics of researching and working in multilingual settings. The particular context I'm working in, multilingual refugee settings, but most of what is in that chapter might be useful for people working in other settings with multilingual participants. Um, so with that in mind, and I'll keep coming back to some of these ethical issues, linguistic ethnography is a focus on the local everyday interactions from participants' perspectives and situating these local everyday interactions and perspectives within wider social structures. So we can't avoid interpretive ways of understanding these interactions. Much of what we do is interpretive. How we do it, I'll come to in a moment. And I'll try and address how that sort of fear or tension around over interpreting discursive data, bringing too much of our reading into it, and under interpreting discursive data, not fully doing justice to previous scholarship. One thing to stress is that linguistic ethnography recognizes that in the past, other anthropological approaches tended to make the strange familiar, so an exoticizing of often colonial and colonized peoples and making their practices interesting to the colonizers' research agendas. What linguistic ethnography attempts to do is to turn that around and make the familiar strange. So, looking at settings that are familiar to the ethnographer and reflecting on those settings rather than necessarily going to settings that are completely unfamiliar. And I'll talk about how we do that by working in ethnographic teams, team ethnography, should I say. So Monica Heller is a key scholar here, and her work really can be really kind of summarized into answering these two questions. How does language shape social processes, and how do social processes influence language? So linguistic ethnography is, as I say, a methodological orientation. It's an approach in which we try to shed light on wider contexts of practice through the microanalysis of interactional data. A really useful book here is Fiona Copeland and Angela Creasy's handbook, Linguistic Ethnography, where they spend each chapter laying out the methodological steps involved in carrying out an ethnography. And that's what I'll be doing in this session, which will last 1.5 hours in total. There was a comment in the chat just before we had our break about cultural entanglements, and it set this up very nicely. Again, none of this is radically recent. You know, those of you that have done a bit of reading around Sapir and going back to the turn of the previous century will know that language has been understood, sorry, not as separate or apart from culture, but part of these assemblages of practices and beliefs. And so, whilst often in lay terms, we tend to talk about culture as homogenous. So I'm from this culture, they are from that culture, as if we can draw kind of neat boundaries around those practices. There is a lot of scholarship, recent and not so recent, around culture being much more fluid. um, we have to sometimes categorize to pin things down, but in terms of working ethnographically, we're actually reflecting on those categories and trying to disentangle, to use the metaphor of the previous poster, the participant, disentangle those relationships. So Brian Street, who worked in literacy studies at King's in London, and others, I think, have used it, the word culture, as a verb. Culture is something we do. It's our cultural practices are shifting, and whilst some may stay with us throughout our entire lives. Others will change and shift as we move across different social settings. So how on earth do we capture all of this mobility and mixing? So we come back to the data, and we look at how we put together different data collection methods in order to help us answer the questions that are at hand. So data are collected and analyzed in particular ways, and they give us a focus from research in linguistics as well as research from ethnography. And the four approaches that I'll be talking about over the next hour are interviews. Yes, that's in my bullet point. Interviews, field work, which is mainly through participant observation, interactional data. So perhaps looking at the example of the little video that someone posted, where you saw, well, that was a meta discussion around language use. It wasn't naturally occurring data in the sense of the participants in that particular post were aware of what they were talking about. But it could be looked at as interactional data because it was part of a conversation. And the text that is produced in those settings, that might be the kinds of textbooks or course books that students use. It might be the text that comes up on a whiteboard or a blackboard in a classroom. It might be my text. So what is the written output in this particular domain that we're researching? One or two of you mentioned research design in the question about what would you like to see covered in today's sessions. So I am going to spend a little bit of time now talking about making clear some of the steps that we go through when we move through the data collection cycle and towards the data analysis stages. So again, do use the chat function if you want to ask specific questions about how these different stages fit together. But initially, step one is what kind of data do you want to get? So go back to your key authors, get your head around the approaches that they take in their work. So I started in the previous session with some of those key scholars. Look at the methods that they use as well as the theories. Identify the primary sources and think carefully about how what they did to achieve their research goals, how do those relate to your research goals? You're all at different stages of your research journeys. I will give one or two examples of the PhD students that I've been working with over a number of years because that's quite a nice level to be thinking at. They're early career researchers. They're not completely new, but they're not completely experienced. And the first error that many of them make, or the first challenge that they face, is wanting to take up a qualitative methodology and apply it to a setting that may not necessarily relate quite so closely to the research paradigm that they wish to work in. Or breaking that down a level, perhaps the specific, tools. I want to use interviews. Okay, so what kinds of interviews and how do they relate to the research question? Secondly, what's the best way to get the data? Again, a broad reading of the literature and some very careful reflection and discussion with colleagues or supervisors or your co-participants help you identify the specific methods, pin down what kinds of observation are we talking about, and what kinds of settings do those observational tools relate best to. So it's really unpicking our assumptions about what we think we should be doing and justifying it through previous research. Identify the procedures. Now that's so easy for me to say. Academics are not always quite so upfront about the procedures that they followed. Again, it requires a very careful reading of the literature as to how do you elicit the steps that this particular researcher went through to get to that section of the research article or the chapter where they talk about their findings. Again, I'm very happy to be transparent about this. Many academics will be quite comfortable writing about findings and theories, and perhaps less comfortable about writing about all of the steps that they took to get there. So handbooks, guidebooks, methodology books are just as important at this stage, if not more so, than journal articles. Again, I'm talking about a particular field in which I work, which cuts across ethnography and sociolinguistics. It may be different in different disciplines. The third step is making notes about what these researchers did and why they did it. Such an important stage in trying to unpick the relationships between research design and answering your research questions, which hopefully you've formulated and reformulated many, many times. In qualitative approaches, research questions tend to get reformulated. That might be very, very different to a more experimental approach, where that probably horrifies some of you who are more familiar with that idea, where you've got your research question and you're very, very working closely very to that question. The whole nature of qualitative ways of working that foreground the emic perspective, as we find out more during the course of our research, requires us to revisit our research questions. So research questions are reformulated in most qualitative ways of working, and I'll come back to this later on. And fourthly, decide on which methods work well together. So hopefully you've got a bit of a sense of steps 1, 2, and 3 are all the preliminary work before we start to talk confidently about, I want to do interviews, I want to collect some artifacts from classrooms. Hopefully, you've done all of that reading and reflection to make sure that your constellation collection of different tools fits together in the way that you really need them to fit together. As I say, it can be iterative. It can change, it must change over time in a very qualitative way of working. Um, but do keep a note, and this is hopefully will counter some of the counter arguments around, well, how does that promote rigor in the research writing up? What I would say to that is the rigor comes from keeping very detailed notes of your methodological decisions. So as you found out more important information, let's call it, about the research setting, how did that reflection on that new information help you to reorient your methodology and your research design? So again, to use a PhD as a sort of example of a research project, if a research student cannot reflect on their methodological decisions in that chapter of the PhD, then that's a poor thesis, because showing how your journey developed is a core sort of foundational principle of your methodology. So in practice, let's try and look at something a bit more concrete, perhaps. And in my PhD, which I did quite a while ago, I carried out ethnographic work in the UK and ethnographic work in northern Pakistan. So I had a lot of data from both settings, a lot of different kinds of domains. I went into classrooms, I worked with families, I visited, leisure settings and shopping malls. So whilst we're tackling the sort of issue of data storage, as you move to collect the data, be systematic about how are you going to organize the storage of the data? And so give it a nice code that relates to, the name of the data. So I've used LLF1 because it relates to language. The interview related to language and literacy friendship, and it was the first interview. I've used LLF2 because it was an interview about language, literacy, and friendship, and it was the second. So design a storage mechanism or approach that allows you to keep a record, because ethnographic data is very unwieldy data, and you'll have a lot of it, and data recording is challenging. So I'm going to now move into those 4 types of data collection tools that I mentioned. So basically, I'm going to talk in detail about interviews, interactional data, texts, and participant observation. So I hope you're interested in some of these, if not all of them. Um, Ethnography, as I'll say in a moment, requires us to use different tools. We couldn't just be doing interviews. That wouldn't really be an ethnographic study. Um, so I need to say something about all of these 4, and I'll end by saying how they fit together. And in the middle, we will have a moment for some reflection and for a question about your own work. So do, as I'm talking through these different methods, I encourage you to think about a research project that you're working on yourselves. Um, I've just remembered we didn't. Oh no, we're still recording, aren't we? Yeah. Do keep in mind a research project that you're working on yourselves, and as I go through the different tools, please do try and think about the specifics of the how the tool would work in your own setting. The first thing to say about interviews is that they support researchers to gain an emic perspective. So if we understand ethnography is trying to foreground the insider perspective of the community that we're working with, then our interviews need to do that specific job. Who are the participants here? What is it we want to find out from them? And how do we get to the emic perspective, which is very challenging because, again, it's rather similar to the research questions. Interview questions take a great deal of drafting and redrafting. So research participants are invited to give information about the question at hand and talk about their experiences. The interviews provide an alternative perspective to that, which is gleaned from field notes or from the other kinds of data. So how do we collect it? Well, there's many different types of interviews, and I just really can only give you a snapshot today of how we might use different interviews for different purposes. We'll all have seen interviews on TV a lot, and it's useful to look at how good interviewers carry out their particular practice. And what's not so useful about following or imitating journalists is that they're working towards having an interview that entertains a specific audience, perhaps, or tries to understand a particular political situation. We're much more focusing at the level of those individuals. And so our research questions need to really sort of pin down the specifics of what it is that we're trying to find out. So really the takeaway from this is work very closely with your colleagues and your supervisors, if you're at that stage, to redraft and pilot interview questions. It's time consuming. It's crucial. It's absolutely crucial that the questions that you ask in your interview get to the kinds of information that you wish to get to. So please do pilot, and please do spend some time having a go at asking those questions to the kinds of participants that you're interested in. one more thing to say about the mismatch between what participants might tell us in an interview and, let's call it, what's really going on in the setting, is an absolutely central premise of carrying out work ethnographically. As I said right at the beginning, we're not trying to get to some ultimate truth about what occurs in research settings. Primarily, we're foregrounding the emic perspective and trying to collate different perspectives on what might be happening in the research setting. So often students will overinterpret the data because they feel, if it's a community they know well, that they know what the participant means. What I would argue in that particular instance is, what's happening in the transcript? It's not your role as an analyst of that transcript to add information because you know the setting, but it's a much more nuanced role, which is to analyze, and I'll do some discourse analysis in the third and final session today. It's to use discourse analysis tool to understanding and analyzing and investigating the transcript of the audio of what occurred on that day. There will be other places in your research write-up to comment on and reflect on the relationships and the subjectivities of the research participants. You're not doing your reader a disservice by attending to the transcript. Rather, you're using your discourse analysis to analyze the transcript to say what's happening at this moment in time in this situated interview, and you can use other parts to reflect on why the participants may have said what they said. I think what I'm trying to say is, take care about filling in gaps and stick to the discourse analysis, but I'll say more about that in a moment. What I'd like to do now is just talk through some steps. So hopefully, if you're new or fairly new to coding and going through the different analytical steps of a project, hopefully by the end of the next 20 minutes, you'll have a sense of what are some of those steps. So the first is, you've transcribed the data, the interview, and you wish to code it. You can do this using software if you have access to software, or you can use paper and pens to start to unpack what is happening in your transcription. Codes can be generated through repeated reading and listening to the interviews. So the first step in all of this is listen multiple times to the recording and read multiple times your transcripts so that you're familiar with the specifics of what is going on. Have other people look at the transcripts if you're working in a team ethnography. And when you are familiar with the transcript, then you can take your research questions and your key terms, and you can start to think through, well, what's happening in the data and how can I start to code, whether it's applying inductively or deductively the different codes to the transcript, depending on whether you want to work very much from theory generating. So you're not applying existing codes, but rather you're looking at what's happening in that specific transcript, or the other way around, you bring your codes from your reading, from other studies, and you use those to help you understand what's happening in the particular transcript. So again, usefully here is the work by Copeland and Crease, who would foreground in their work as linguistic ethnographers the importance of theorizing qualitative research in interviews. So the interview itself is an interaction which is laden with different power dynamics. So for decades now, we have been required to attend to the discursive nature of an interview. It is socially situated. You're never going to get to some ultimate truth through asking your research questions. So how do we understand this particular research participant's perspective through the use of discourse analysis? And Holstein and Gubrium would say meaning is not merely elicited by apt questioning, nor simply transported through the respondent's replies, but it's actively communicatively assembled, which is another way of saying it's co-constructed in the interview. So we're looking at those emic perspectives by carrying out a discourse analysis of how they co-construct meaning. Secondly, if we want to move from codes to themes, then we need to convert the comments, whether these are comments in MaxQDA or in other software, or they're sticky yellow post-it notes. You need to convert your individual codes to larger thematic categories. We need an example. So in my example here is an interview transcript. So I was carrying out a study of the different kinds of reading and writing, both formal and informal. So apply for a migrant who was applying for a visa to move from northern Pakistan to northern England over a number of months. And I was interested in what kinds of literacy practices sustain his family's migrations. Several generations had migrated. I say migrated, but they're very transnational relations. They move regularly between both countries and other countries. So what kinds of reading and writing sustains these transnational ties? And I'm asking, the reason I've selected this particular transcript is because we're sitting in front of his laptop looking at his Facebook postings, and he's explaining to me, the key participant in my study is explaining to me why people are using different varieties, different social media platforms. So it's ethnographic in the sense that it was one day in his home on his laptop after his migration. So this is when he'd got his visa and he was sitting in Lancashire, in the north of England. And I want to know why certain members of the family are using certain language varieties and styles. I tried to choose a very short extract that doesn't require too much reading. Hopefully you've had a moment to read through it. The key takeaway here is that I'm coding for the person who is making who is involved in the interaction, so the brother and Zahir. I'm coding for the technology that's being used, so I'm coding for mobiles. And thirdly, I'm coding for the language variety. So I'm interested in who is doing what technology they're using, and which different language variety from their repertoire, from their multilingual repertoire, are they using. So it's a very basic example of how we get started from a simple transcript, which doesn't require, I'm not doing conversation analysis, I'm doing some fairly basic content coding at this stage that allows me to say something about those three codes, which hopefully what you can see in the purple is my pulling together of the three codes into a theme. And my theme is the relationship between mobiles. I'm trying to move relationship between mobiles and language. So having coded for who is doing what, the technology that they're using and the variety that they're doing it in, I'm able to start to move up to the next level, which is a claim about the relationship between mobile technology use in transnational families who are moving between Pakistan and the UK. So this is really known as the memoing stage. We're moving from codes to themes to that higher level of interpretation, where the themes are then used as the headings and subheadings for identifying patterns. Under each thematic heading, extract from the data, exemplify the theme or illustrate the theme that has been collected, and they become evidence for additional patterns. So it doesn't mean that there won't be other themes that include language variety, people, and technology. It simply means that because of the number of frequencies and the way that this particular participant understood the relationship between these three items, they become their own theme. So again, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but hopefully what it does is it gives you an example of how we start to move from content coding to thematic coding and memoing. Now, the fourth step, if we want to break it down into steps, would be when you start to bring in the literature that you've read and you start to bring in prior scholarship to the discussion of these themes. So the themes are then used as headings and subheadings, and you're moving from micro level codes to patterns across the data sets. And it's important to say at this point is I've also coded my interactional data sets and my participant observation field notes using similar codes. So the codes from the interview are then interpreted alongside the codes from my other data sets that I'm using as part of my ethnography. What I thought would be useful would be to show you how all of this gets written up. How have we gone from a code to a theme to a memo to interpretation? So in the final written thesis and publications from this study, I was able to write, there is a shift in footing in the following line of the transcript after Usman interrupts the interview to explain why he thinks Zahir is using English. In He Don't Use Mobiles as Much, Usman is attempting to construct a link between using mobile phones and developing the ability to use non-standard varieties such as slang Urdu, what he calls slang Urdu. Usman backs this up with an argument by example and indulges in positive self-representation, where he illustrates the use of mobile phones and the ability to use abbreviated script by using his own ability as an example. In this case, Usman seems to construct a link between his own creativity with digital literacy and his use of mobile phones. So in a nutshell, I've taken my theme, I've gone back to the literature around digital literacies. I've used a lot of hedging language, which really tries to foreground that this is my interpretation of what happened across multiple data sets. So I'm using my field notes, which are always tricky to get into data analysis. Well, they're more tricky to get into data analysis than they are than interview data. I'm referring to pointing to it on the screen because, again, this is an interactional moment where Usman and I are together in the research setting, and I'm establishing a claim based on the interactional data, the field note data, and the interview data. And I'm using the terminology from sociolinguistics. There is a footing in the following line, and Usman backs this up with an argument by example and indulges in positive self-presentation. This is conceptual theoretical positioning from my field, which I'm applying to the data analysis. I've packed a lot into a very short example, but I do hope that it at least illustrates how we put together our different data collection methods and how we might move from coding to theming to memoing. What I'd like you to do now is for 5 minutes, a short activity, if you could, which is to think about your own work. I'm just trying to move the Teams meeting. And if you could put in the chat one code and one memo which relates to the code from data you're working with. So what I mean here is hopefully you've done a bit of research already, or you're doing some research at the moment, and you can think of an example of one code, like my code around language varieties or my code around technologies. How did you code your interview data? And then how did you move from multiple codes to starting to interpret how these codes fit together, and how did you memo that? Okay, over to you. 5 minutes, if you could put an example in the chat. If you feel it's not exactly what I mean, don't worry. Just have a go at putting in a code and some interpretation from your own work, please. And we'll give you just 5 minutes to pop some examples in the chat. Thank you. Thank you for the items in the chat. These are all very useful, and I'm going to comment on them in a moment. Vishnu, how are we doing for time? Did I start early?
No, you
Did I?
started right on time, so you're okay with time.
Well, and what time are we breaking? What time will be the end of the hour and a half?
This session. So this session will end at 12.
At 12. Great. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so do continue to pop your examples in the chat. I'm just going to comment a little bit on what we've got there. I'll work up from the bottom. Code, English language usage. The memo was English language teacher described a situation of never switching between languages, even when she knew students did not understand the language. She explained that English is a foreign language. Okay, great. So we've moved from what is the language and what are people's attitudes or perceptions of that language? I can see how that works. Anna's is code, language practice in home reading with kids, aspiration and aspirations for family and future identity. The memo is how this focused on reading in the home language with child to reinforce the connection between the cultural. Great. So again, sort of moving, obviously we're coding for language, the language variety, and then how people are understanding the purpose or the prestige or the use of that particular variety. Great. Someone else working on language. The code was language hierarchy. Nice. So in that example, where we've got the code is the language hierarchy and the memo is the use of English over a shared native language in the formal institution, that the decision making there is to code. I would the best way of putting it, I guess, is that looking at, first of all, you've looked at what the language varieties are, you've done the work to establish what is the hierarchy. So you've looked at the variety alongside other varieties, and then you've coded for the hierarchy, which again is works really well. Somebody has coded for identity and memoed for space. So I am not going to try and interpret that, but well, I am going to try, but I might be completely wrong. So identities is what I was coding for when I coded who was doing what. So that was related to identity. I assume you're coding for who is doing what and what space they're doing it in, which is a really nice relationship between code and identity. And the last one that I'll talk about is for memory. In a small interview set with PhD participants, lower level codes around which language participants use to discuss food. So nice examples, very specific code, food, and then building into a higher level code around food as home and food as inherently Punjabi rather than English. So that's a nice way of putting it. None of these steps or stages are so clearly separated. So Joanna has gone from a low level code to a higher level code. And I'm guessing that the person who coded for language hierarchy has also had to do some coding around, as I said before, the different hierarchies. So I appreciate all of your examples. Thank you. I will need to carry
Tony,
on
there is a
with,
question, I don't, not related to code, but related to research questions. So if you
yeah.
want to take that, so I can read this to you.
Yeah, that'd be,
A
yes, thank
question
you.
about a question about research questions and whether each of these are equally valid. So number one, being interested to characterize a setting in an open-ended bottom-up manner, perhaps leading to the development of a theory, versus starting with a theory and looking for a suitable test setting to test that theory.
I'm going to have to
I'll
find it because there's a lot going on there. Who
I
do you know that?
it's from Joe. I can copy that and I can put it at the end of the chat. So give me a sec.
Yes, thanks.
Just did it.
Great. A question about research. Um, valid. Okay, being interested to characterize a setting in an open-ended bottom-up manner, perhaps leading to the development of theory, versus starting with a theory and looking at so I think what I think what I understand from that, Joanna, and tell me if I'm wrong. So it's about how do we say something meaningful about a specific setting and understanding a specific setting. Do we go in with an open, so grounded theory was your is number two, I think. Sorry, no, grounded theory is number one. Going into the setting with an open-ended bottom-up manner, which we would call grounded theory, and doing your data collection, doing all your data analysis, and then theorizing from the specifics of the findings. Now, I would argue that before we just talk about number two, I'd argue to theorize and what you call the development of a theory, I would suggest you'd still need to be looking at other theories to inform how you move to a theory of what is happening in that particular setting. I mean, 100% grounded theory was you would be theorizing from what was going on in that domain. But I'm assuming for most of us, we'd still want to look at how we make theories in our particular discipline in order to theorize about what's happening in the setting. That's quite different to number two, as you obviously are pointing out, starting with the theory and looking for a suitable setting to test the theory. It's a really good question. Is that still qualitative? Testing theory. It depends how you're using the word testing.
It's like
I would,
I
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, I was exactly thinking the same thing. To me, that's very quantitative, very much cognitive. Like you take a theory and test it as opposed to the other one.
yeah. If I agree with Vishnu, if you're literally unpicking the theory and using it to guide every step of your research, then that is quite quantitative in the sense of you've gone in a priori with your decisions about how you think things work, which is what the theory is, and you've applied that to particular events. So that's it's not experimental, but it is how I understand the word test here. Whereas you could go in with a theory and collect your data and see what aspects kind of fit with the theory and where are the differences, the similarities, and all of that. And sort of that would still be quite a qualitative way of working. And that's obviously what we do. We do our literature review first, and that really influences what we do in the research setting. I hope that answers your question, but let me know, Joanna, if it doesn't. I'll crack on with the slides because I want to get through all of the other three tools before we break. So apologies for speeding up a little bit, but hopefully you'll be able to go back and review the recordings if I do move quite quickly. Discourse analysis is what we use to analyze our interview transcripts, and I'll be talking about more about that in the next session where I will do some discourse analysis and we'll have a go at that. So I won't say too much about that now. I'll move to the second tool, which is observation. So in a very open ethnographic approach, a blank page and a pen are the tools of the ethnographer, writing down what's going on, what we see, what we hear, what we smell, keeping those either very unstructured or, to go back to Joanna's question, if you've got a really clear idea of what you're going to focus on, you can have closed observations. It can still be ethnographic, absolutely. But you've already narrowed down what you're going to find out by deciding a priori what there is to be found out by using more closed approaches. All ethnographers engage in some kind of observation. I would argue, and I think others would agree, if there's no observation, participant observation, I'll talk in a moment the difference between classroom observations in kind of education studies, which are quite different to ethnographic observation. if you're not doing any kind of observation, I'd argue then that's still a qualitative approach, but it isn't necessarily ethnographic. Um, Observation, it often involves some kind of shadowing of those we are researching. I think that's really important. There's so much I could say about how you position yourself in the research setting. Are you an active participant? Are you a co-participant? Are you a participant observer? So there's a huge literature on this. Please let me know if you'd like to know more. But you need to decide before you get anywhere near to your research setting, are you getting involved in what is going on there, or are you taking various steps back from what's going on, and how does that position you in terms of the power dynamics? You're always going to be recognized as the researcher. So writing about that in your methodology is a fundamental part of writing about your field work. We don't really talk about biases, certainly in the literature that I contribute to and the work that I do and the scholars that I work with. All research is biased. We tend to look at our, well, not tend to, we do look at our subjectivities. So Blommet would describe this as, it's not like other approaches. We're not trying to reduce the complexity to an a priori selected range of features, but we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to look at all the complexity that's going on and then do something with that. So Blommet reminds us that the ethnographer is to remain open to what he or she observes in the field and avoid the use of imposed external categories. Whereas Himes from the 60s onwards tells us that we can't but help arrive in the field without some prior view of what's interesting. So there are tensions in what Blommet's saying and what Himes is saying, but the third bullet point is what we would all agree on. We never start from a completely blank slate. We always bring ourselves into what we observe, and we need to write about that when we write about our positionality. And we would refute criticisms that suggest that this is bias, but we'd rather understand this notion of bias as being part of the subjectivities of doing this kind of research. How do we do it? Well, we keep field notes. So we go into the research setting and we keep a written record either through notepads or audio recordings of notes or your laptop, perhaps. This, in the traditional ethnographic literature, this is known as inscription because field notes always, as the previous slide suggested, we are inscribing ourselves in the process. They are authored accounts. They are not neutral accounts, another word that we wouldn't really be using, but because they are authored by us and we are recognizing our subjectivities as part of that interpretative process. So conducting observations and writing up the field notes. So field notes will always differ. And again, there's a literature on this. I recommend the Copeland and Crease handbook if you want to look at specific examples of templates that you can use when you go into the research setting. To what degree is it a blank page, which I would never recommend a completely blank page, and to what degree can you do a bit of planning around, if to use the Instagram post that some of you shared earlier, if we really want to capture phonological, grammatical variations at that very fine-grained interactional level, then we're not using video. Well, it depends. Are we using video, are we using audio, or are we just keeping field notes? Decisions need to be made well before you go into the field. They may be very long, detailed on first entering the field, and you refine your field notes as you write them up. So my recommendation would be you keep your rough field notes during the day when you're in the setting, and that evening or very soon after, you rewrite your field notes with your reflections. There's lots of ways of doing this, but ideally you are reflecting on the day as close to the event as possible. So you kind of have two written records at the end of each day or close to that, where you've got the initial insights with all of the sort of insecurities around have I captured everything? And then you have a very soon after the event recording of additional reflections on that first, and it's not a draft, you're not redrafting them. Each write-up is a different data set, and it's a really interesting literature around the writing of field notes. It's not like an essay where you redraft and reformulate, rather than each is a set of data that can be returned to and analyzed, um, but through your reflections of at which point on your timeline was this record taken. And you write about that when you write up your analysis. Oops. So analyzing field notes, after the first complete read through, a second read through begins in which the researcher starts to thematically code or categorize the data. Unlikely that that would take place during the data collection phase. You can reflect and reflect and reflect on field notes. You can write and write and write as much as you are able to. That's not it's actually starting the analysis, because your reflections are made up of your insights on what you saw. But I would argue that that's still data collection, and that the analysis is when you start to read through them, ideally having left the research setting, and start to theme and code and categorize. That takes a lot of reading and a lot of thinking. So it's unlikely, particularly with a short ethnography, to be happening whilst you're still collecting data. And your themes and codes again relate to what different kinds of things are going on, what are the differences, what are the shifts in activities. Again, you move to sort of thematic analysis after your coding. So Erickson would say that not to focus on too small a kind of level, but at that point start to look at the bigger units of meaning. As I did in that very small example, I was looking at the relationship between people, technologies, and language varieties. Erickson suggesting you need to start to understand how people establish a relationship between, for example, language variety, technology, and the people in their lives. So instead of imposing outside categories, linguistic anthropology induces analytical categories that participants either articulate or presuppose in their action. And it insists on evidence that participants themselves are presupposing categories central to the analysis. So that's the first of the, I think, Joanna's question, or was it Anna's question, where more grounded theory towards imposing categories. A third reading of the field notes reduces categories by collapsing data further into manageable units, where you're looking for connections across categories. The third of the four types of data collection is interactional data. So perhaps you go into a classroom with your ethical consent, and you speak to the learners, you speak to the teacher, you identify two students that you're going to audio record, you pin your lapel microphone to their collar or on the desk, you have your audio recorder on the desk, and you audio record their interactions in a 50-minute lesson. Or you, again, with prior consent and all of the setting up of the research that you've done, you operate a video in the classroom which isn't static, and you move your video so you capture teacher talk, you capture learner talk, you capture whole class talk, you capture reading and writing, instructional pedagogy, you capture a lot more through video, but you don't have to use video. It comes with its own challenges and constraints. Goffman would call these platform events. In my research in refugee settings, I would use audio and not video for ethical reasons. I would anonymize all the audio, and I wouldn't put the participants under the kind of stress of being filmed, but other people might work differently to that. So in a lot of classroom data, we are interested in these platform events. We're not trying to get to some private moment necessarily. It's not all about getting to what people really do. We want to understand what they do in a lesson or what they do when they sit having a cup of tea with their boss in a workplace setting. These are platform events. So small recording devices, putting the recording device next to the participants, not using static video cameras because you'll miss an awful lot of what is going on. Operate the video camera yourself and make sure the microphone is where you need it to be. I've mentioned piloting once already. I can't emphasize enough the importance of piloting in any research project using ethnographic approaches. Often some ethnographers won't use the term pilot because when you're in the setting, you would say that your research project has already started. I tend to use the word because I think it helps people, it encourages people to sort of try out their interview questions with other people, not their chosen research participants. It helps people to sort of try out filming a lesson so that you know the intricacies of operating technologies before you get into. So that it's piloting in that sense, but again, purists in ethnography would say once you're in the setting, that's all data. So moving to analysis of interactional data, again, it's not always linear and it is quite messy. So the first stage will be to listen and view your recordings over and over again. And the purpose of this stage generally to identify the themes, usual to approach the data with some ideas about what you're interested in. And this is where I'll refer to the research around rich points. So rich points are sections of the data which stand out as being unusual in the interaction in some way, which seem to the researcher different or difficult to understand. So people call them different things. People call them critical incidents or critical moments. Agile calls them rich points. You as the researcher are noticing from your repeated reading and viewing of your data sets something significant. So Snell and Lefstein would say, you know, these are opportunities in their research where they work with in classroom settings. These are important moments where they identify a critical case. How does it throw into relief the everyday practices of teaching? I'm coming towards the end now. I'm almost at the fourth and final research tool, but it's really important to mention reflexivity, or whether it's in interactional data, whether it's in the other three tools that we're talking about today, um, continually reflecting on how these different data sources fit together is an important part of how you write up your findings. So, you know, interactional data for some will be the core data. So field notes, interviews, and texts can play a supplementary role. And that's very much the case in my field, which is applied linguistics, where, you know, we're really interested in, to use the Instagram example, phonologically, grammatically, how does the communicative resources of that situated interaction, how does that fit into the social practices of that individual or community? And how might we bring in our interview data to help us explain that interaction, but actually at the core of that is the interaction. That won't be the case for everybody, and it's certainly not the case for all applied linguistics, but it is the case, sorry, for all qualitative approaches, but it is the case for linguistic ethnography. So my fourth and final data collection tool are written texts. And in the session after the break, the data that we'll be looking at are taken from a project looking at multilingual literacies. So I'll be talking and showing you some data of how we use an ethnographic approach, taking an orientation that is associated with critical multilingualism, all the things that Holly mentioned and I mentioned at the beginning of today's event. And so I'm foregrounding this now by mentioning that the fourth tool is collecting the reading and writing, the policy documents, the school materials, whatever is related to your research goal in terms of written material. That's your fourth tool for data collection. And then you can have interviews. So I would sit with my participants and talk to them about their visa applications. And we have the visa application in front of us. I talk to them about the social media posts. We have the social media posts in front of us. I talk up to the teacher about their lesson plan, and we have the lesson plan in front of us. So you can use the lesson plan separately, and you can analyze what's going on in the lesson plan separately, or you can use that data set alongside your interview data to look at the relationship between these different sets of data. So just before I finish, I just wanted to we'll have a moment for questions. We're just almost out of time, but we'll have a moment for questions. I'll talk about literacy studies when I kick off the next session. I'll start with this slide. But what I would like to do is just mention what we'll be doing after. We'll have a 30-minute break for, well, it'll be lunch in the UK. It'll be another kind of snack elsewhere in the world. In the session and the third and final session, I'll be talking about discourse ethnography. So I'll link what I've already talked about in terms of ethnography and multilingual literacies to carrying out some critical discourse analysis. Vishnu, are there any questions in the chat that we could try and answer, or does anybody want to put any questions in the chat that haven't been that have come up?
There's no, I don't see any questions, but I think we don't start our next session until 1:30, isn't it? That's what it's in the schedule. So if you want to take 10 extra minutes, so it's a long break.
It's a long break. I thought we'd just have 30 minutes because I know we said we'd have an hour break now, but I know for people who are on a very different time zone, it's quite late in the evening for them to have a whole hour. I thought if we took 30 minutes now, we could keep it moving.
So you want to just take a 30-minute lunch break instead of coming back at 1:30?
I think most people are not in our hemisphere or whatever time zone, let's call it. And I think it's quite late in the evening. So I'd be happy to have 30 minutes now and we'll crack on in half an hour.
So there's a question. There's a question.
Okay. Can a study be called an ethnography if it uses observations, interviews, and reflections about interactional data? Thank you for that. It's a good question, but it's one of those questions where it's really depends on who you're reading and what kind of ethnographic approach you're positioning yourself as using. It's a good question because for me, I've always read a lot of literature from full ethnographies, which tend to be people spending a great deal of time in the research setting. And my PhD thesis, my PhD supervisor was an ethnographer. I think I would argue some linguistic ethnographies don't require such engagement in the research setting, but I know people would argue against that. They would dispute that claim. But what I'm trying to say is it's not just the tools that you use, but it's your engagement in the research setting and the literature that you draw on. I think that's the most succinct answer to the question. Um, so on that point, let's have 30 minutes and I will stop the recording then because that's otherwise it's going to be a huge file to try and upload to the website. I'll stop the recording and I'll give you some yeah well there's the literature in the slides, Hamda, are a really good place to start, and we'll upload the slides with the recording so you'll be able to see the literature. Yeah, I'll stop the recording now and then we'll come back in through the same link in 30 minutes. Okay, great. Thanks everybody. See you soon.